I'm Alan G. I'm a professor of English at Georgia College, and I currently direct the creative writing programs there. I'm also the editor for 2040 Books, a multicultural press. I met James in 1987. I went to the Iowa Writers Workshop to study fiction and ended up in his fiction workshop, not knowing how I ended up there. I was just assigned. And he took me under his wing after reading some of my work and mentored me. We used to meet every week. He'd give me a book, and I'd read it. Some of them, like Miguel de Unamuno's The Tragic Nature of Life, Richard Wright's Native Son, Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, and Shadow and Act. And every week we'd read a book, and James was quite reclusive at that time. He was in a stage of just keeping to himself, not wanting to assimilate in the way that a lot of other African Americans were. And he wanted to keep his authentic self. And so he enjoyed, at that time, talking about his background growing up in Savannah. And I told him about my Asian background, Chinese American background, growing up in New York City. And we enjoyed that exchange of cultural backgrounds and ideas, and it continued on for over 25 years until he passed away this past late July. I'm also his biographer, and I've been gathering material for 3 years, and I'm in the stage of doing primary interviews and secondary interviews now, and I imagine the biography will take from 3 to 4 years to write, of just sheer dedicated writing time to that project only. And I also had an essay accepted by Plowshares recently about his being my mentor. I'd like to talk about James's work from an ideological standpoint in terms of progression. Ralph Ellison was his mentor, and Ralph brought out the idea that Americans and American cultural identity was already black and white, that American culture was not specifically white, and it seemed radical at the time. Now it's very passé. Now we know, of course, that people take their influences from everywhere. So James had this to begin with, and you can see this progression in his first book of stories, Hue and Cry. He draws upon, there's a lot of protest work in there, and he draws upon his background growing up in Savannah and his own personal life. But then with Hue and Cry, that's Hue and Cry, but then with Elbow Room, what happens with Elbow Room is the work becomes more ideological. He's beginning to take what Ralph has taught him and apply it. And so you get, James told me that the characters are often cultural composites or types. And so he has characters who listen to country music and are from the South, and they embrace influences from different backgrounds. They're all like that throughout the entire book. The characters in Elbow Room are like that. But there's a progression in his work when James writes his memoir, Crab Cakes, and then in his essay collection, A Region Not Home, he actually goes global, looking beyond America for cultural influences, and a lot of that was from his travels in Japan. So basically he looks for Eastern influences to see how one can nurture oneself to become the most idealistic, or I would say peaceful citizen of the United States of America. And it's a principle that drives James' work. His whole career, so much of James's work is aimed at promoting this idea of a civil or harmonious community, looking at the country that way. And that takes its influence from James's studying of the 14th Amendment. James wrote that, and he's writing about Turgey in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson, and he writes, what Turgey was proposing in 1896, I think, was that each United States citizen would attempt to approximate the ideals of the nation, be on at least conversant terms with all its diversity, carry the mainstream of the culture inside himself. As an American, by trying to wear these clothes, he would be a synthesis of high and low, black and white, city and country, provincial and universal. If he could live with these contradictions, he would be simply a representative American. That's what James is aiming for in Elbow Room. And notice it's black and white at that point. And then he moves beyond that, because this is from his essay on becoming an American writer. But then he moves beyond that to start looking for Eastern influences to also incorporate into, taking from other, not just Asian Americans or Japanese Americans, but from Japanese citizens or Chinese citizens. Wherever he could find something from a culture that was an idea that could be incorporated into being an American, that excited him. So that gave him great enthusiasm. So he was really welcoming to all people as a teacher. And that's often why he was called the soul of the workshop. And Marilyn Robinson was called the heart. And Frank was called the body or the mind. So you had body, heart, and soul is something I've heard before.